This is meant to be an address to the European Union on inclusive dialogue, democratic governance, and lasting peace in Sudan. Honorable members of the EU and the Sudanese community at large, we are gathered at a moment when conflicts across the globe test not our compassion, but the clarity of our values. In Sudan, the war has come to represent something fundamental, a clash between the Sudanese people who aspire for freedom, peace, and justice, and an Islamist group which seeks to regain power and escape accountability for the theft of the nation's wealth and the destruction of its future. Number one, moral duty and strategic stakes. Europe's humanist tradition shaped by Christianity, the Enlightenment, the experience of totalitarianism, the rule of law is not mere history. It demands action. Our commitment to freedom and human dignity requires that we cannot ignore the suffering in Sudan. From a geopolitical standpoint, instability there threatens migration flows, regional breakdown, and security risks for the Horn of Africa and beyond. The war's true fault lines. What began or has often been portrayed as a contest between the SAF and the RSF has evolved deeper. One side aligns with civilian demands for a democratic transition and upholds principles of accountability. The other is driven by ambition to reclaim ideological dominance, evade responsibility for past blunder, and perpetuate impunity. Civilians are paying the price. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, famine looming. There is no militia chaos alone. It is institutional betrayal, ideological extremism, and systematic exclusion. Number three, justice, reform, and accountability. A nation cannot be rebuilt without acknowledging its crimes. The Islamist influence army must not simply change uniforms. It must be transformed into a professional representative force under civilian control. And those who have looted national resources, carried out massacres, or violated the rights of Sudanese people must face justice. As President Yursala says, there is no peace without justice. We must also remember the warning of the African anti-corruption leader Nuha Rebado: when corruption is king, there is no accountability of leadership and no trust in authority. Number four, pillars for lasting peace. Europe must support a framework built upon inclusive dialogue, democratic governance, security reform, and justice, which will be the focus of my talk today. Let's start with inclusive dialogue, giving voices to civilians, minorities, women, reform forces, not just military actors or ideological hardliners. You must have noticed that, and Mr. Tugud is going to elaborate on this, whichever peace negotiation mechanism held, they are manipulated in such a way to give the Islamists a leverage while excluding others. Democratic governance, rebuilding institutions that are transparent, accountable, and answerable to all regions, not dominated by one ideology or center. Security sector reform and justice. Tassis speaks about historical justice, and I'm going to elaborate on the differences between transformational justice and historical justice. Security sector reform and justice, forming a non-sectarian national army under civilian oversight, prosecuting war criminals who are wanted by the ICC, seizing stolen wealth, ensuring impunity is not the price of power. Number 5, Europe's role, principles in action. Europe must do more than speak, it must act. The tools are there: diplomatic pressure, conditional aid, multilateral forums, the ICC, the EU's capacity to protect the rule of law. Let us remember that justice is not a luxury in crisis, it is the foundation of peace. As one African voice reminds us, there is no accountability, you just have to minimize. If there is no accountability, you minimize corruption. Justice demands that we frame this war correctly, not as just a military contest, but as a struggle between those who seek a Sudan of freedom, peace, and dignity, and those who seek power, impunity, and the continuation of suffering. Europe has both the moral heritage and the strategic interest to stand on the side of the Sudanese people. Let us commit to policy that reflects that clarity, one grounded in inclusive dialogue, democratic governance, and justice. For when we do this, we don't only honor Sudan's future, but ours as well. Speaking about the issue of security reform and justice, I want to say that no serious reflection on Sudan's future can escape the fairest truth. The Sudanese state was never built on a just social contract. Rather, it was erected on a structure akin to apartheid, anchored in the so-called crisis belt, stretching from عطبرة to الجيلي. شريط الأزمة، ما أسميه شريط الأزمة. There, a narrow ideological elite entrenched itself, monopolizing the nation's material and spiritual resources and erecting a rigid hierarchy grounded less in ethnicity per se than in patronage and loyalty. Any discussion of reform must begin from this distorted foundation. Security reform and transitional justice are the twin gateways forward. Yet transitional justice in its conventional sense risks obscuring the core of the problem. The structural violence of the Sudanese state, العنف البنيوي للدولة السودانية, that violence extending across time and geography fell disproportionately on groups distinguished by ethnicity, region, class, and gender. A poor woman south of the belt, الحزام في الخرطوم, for instance, endured forms of state oppression. Her counterpart elsewhere was spared by sheer accident of birth and location. This is why the idea of historical justice advanced by the Sudanese People's Movement and later embraced by Ta'sis is so crucial. Historical justice moves beyond individual misconduct to address cultural and institutional structures, demanding profound reform in the judiciary, education, and media. How can an education system that glorifies slave traders as national heroes produce a generation capable of healing wounds and weaving back the social fabric? How can an authoritarian media allow the silence to speak? Historical justice, my fellow friends here, however, cannot be pursued in a vacuum. It requires a fusion of traditional systems with modern institutions. South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation experiment reminds us of the utility of customary practices in confronting past abuses, while simultaneously referring major crimes to judicial process. That blend is precisely what Sudan needs, a justice rooted in tradition yet elevated by universal standards. Politics, unlike mathematics, is the art of possible. Hence the relevance of the old jurisprudential principle to maximize benefit and minimize harm, offering senior military leaders immunity from prosecution in exchange for their permanent withdrawal from politics may serve a higher good than the natural impulse for retribution. But no calculus can equate those who orchestrated genocide with those who pulled triggers under duress. Still, the success of historical justice hinges on the creation of a new judiciary and security sector. Here, the very notion of reform collapses. There is no institutional memory, no vital remnant on which to build. The war has laid bare the moral bankruptcy of all combatants without exception. What is needed is not a patchwork repair, but the founding of new institutions. For decades, Sudan's military regimes, foremost among them the Inghaz, systematically excluded officers from the east and the west. يعني أي ضابط بيصل رتبة لواء بينزلوه المعاش من شرق السودان أو من غربه. Ensuring few ever rose beyond the rank of Major General. The general staff was mobilized by a narrow geographic elite اللي هم من المنطقة بتاعت عطبرة للجيلي. كل هيئة الأركان بتيجي من المنطقة دي. From such exclusion, arrogance and racism festered. Some commanders, alienated from their people, became brokers of war, bombing schools in Juba mountains or using chemical weapons in market like Al-Kuma, more loyal to self-interest than to national belonging. اللي هم الجماعة مننا من الهامش اللي هم حسا واقفين مع السلطة بتاعت بور السودان وبيقتلوا في أهاليهم. South Africa took 6 years to restructure its security forces through a quota system that rebalanced regional and ethnic representation at every rank. Ethiopia and Uganda offer yet other models for building police and military from scratch on fair representation and regional balance, rather than political loyalty or ideological capture. For Sudan, this is not reform but founding a historical necessity. In the end, the Sudanese war did not merely destroy infrastructure and resources, it desecrated sanctities, violated bodies, and nearly succeeded in extinguishing the very spirit of the people. From such ruin, reform cannot be born, only founding can. A founding that unites historical justice with security, restructuring, and builds institutions on competence and fairness, not ethnic privilege. Only such a path can rescue the idea of Sudanese nation from dissolution and grant it a second chance of existence. Thank you. شكرا جزيلا.